Wyoming Territory, 1884. The wind carried grit, and the sound of a train whistle as the iron engine hissed into the Rawlins station, kicking up dust and judgment. Geneva Clarke stepped off the train with her hands tight around the handle of her carpetbag, her heart thudding like hooves on hard ground. Her dress, though neat, was a touch too fine for the frontier, and her eyes scanned the platform for a man with a red kerchief in his lapel, the sign she had been told to look for. He was not there. Instead, whispers curled around her like smoke from the depot clerk, two women with basket hats, a boy selling papers. She heard it in their eyes before their mouths even moved. The letter had come ahead of her. They knew. Somehow they always knew. She had answered an ad for a mail-order bride. A widower in Rawlins, respectable with land. He had written back kindly, but when she shared her truth that she had once worked in a house of ill repute in St. Louis after being left destitute with 2 children to feed, the letters stopped. She came anyway. She had nowhere else to go. A woman behind her sniffed. "That's her," she said to no one in particular. "The one with the past." Geneva held her head high, but her cheeks burned. Her children, Joanna and Jessie, stood just behind her, quiet. Joanna was 10, Jessie 8. Both clung to her skirt, eyes wide. "Come on," Geneva whispered to them. "We'll find something." But Rawlins wasn't offering much. She walked the main street until her boots blistered, asking after boarding houses, work, anything. Doors shut, faces turned. By sundown, she was sitting on a wooden crate behind the livery stable, her children tucked into her sides and her hands shaking. "You lost," a voice said. She looked up. A tall man stood in the alley's mouth, sun behind him, casting his frame in gold and shadow. He wore a trail coat dark with dust, and his black hat was low over his brow. A rifle was slung across his back, but it was the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with suspicion, that made her sit straighter. "I am not lost," Geneva said. "Just waiting for what? A chance." He nodded once and stepped into the alley closer. "Name's Lawson Dade." Geneva hesitated. "Geneva Clarke." His eyes moved to her children, then returned to her face. "You came in on the eastbound," she nodded. "I heard about what happened. Man who sent for you changed his mind." She looked down. "You heard right." Lawson crouched in front of Jessie, who flinched a little. Lawson stayed still. "You hungry, son?" Jessie nodded. "Got stew on the fire." "Come on." Geneva shifted. "We do not take charity." Lawson straightened. "Good. I am not offering any. I run a small cattle spread out west of town. I need a cook. My last one ran off with a peddler headed to Utah." Geneva blinked. "You are offering me work. I am offering you dinner. We will talk about work after." She searched his face for a catch, a trap, anything false, but all she saw was a man who had seen more than he said. "All right," she said. They followed him through the twilight. His horse, a tall roan, waited hitched behind the livery. He lifted both children up into the saddle like they were made of feathers, then helped Geneva up behind them. They rode west, the sun slipping behind the mountains, the wind cooling. Geneva watched the back of Lawson's coat as he led the horse on foot. The silence between them was not awkward. It was something else, something patient. His cabin was small but solid, tucked against the foot of a ridge. Smoke curled from the chimney. There was a barn, a well, and a fence line that ran farther than she could see in the dark. He brought them inside. The stew was hot and thick, and Geneva nearly cried at the first bite. Her children ate like they had not in weeks. Lawson poured them water, set out blankets, and said little. When the children fell asleep on the rug near the hearth, Geneva found herself standing beside him near the stove. "You do not care what people say about me?" she asked. He looked at her then, really looked. "I care what I see with my own eyes. You do not know what I have been. Maybe not. But I know what I have been." She waited. He shook his head. Not tonight, she nodded. All right. He handed her a folded blanket. You take the bed, I will sleep in the barn. Lawson, there is no shame in rest, Geneva. Not here. She watched him walk out under the stars and close the door behind him. That night, she lay in a clean bed with her children curled beside her, listening to the wind through the trees, and for the first time in a long time she felt safe. Not saved. Not forgiven. But safe. The next morning she rose early and made coffee. Lawson came in from the barn with hay in his hair and the smell of horses on him. "You still need a cook?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes tired but kind. "I do. Then I will work, but I want to earn our keep. No favors, no pity." "I would insult you with neither," he said. She nodded. "Good." He walked to the stove, poured himself a cup, and leaned against the wall. "You are not what they say, you know." She met his eyes. "Neither are you." He smiled, then not wide, not showy, just real, and something small and warm opened between them. It was not love. Not yet. But it was the start of something that could be. The third morning, Lawson handed Geneva a set of rough linen dish towels folded square, edges fraying. She took them without a word, her sleeves already damp with water from the wash basin. Outside, frost still clung to the fence rails, though the sun had crested the ridge behind the cabin. "You said you could sew," he said, nodding toward the worn towels. "I can mend better than most," she replied, turning one over in her hands. "But I'll need a needle that isn't bent sideways." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small tin box. "Belonged to my mother." Geneva accepted it gently, surprised by the trust in the gesture. "That's kind of you." "She'd have liked you," Lawson said without looking at her, stepping back outside to split kindling. Geneva sat by the hearth once the children had finished their breakfast and curled up with their school readers. She worked the needle through the fabric, her fingers steady, and tried not to think about what it meant that he was giving her something from his past instead of asking about hers. By midday, she'd boiled beans, hung a length of washed shirts from the porch rail, and taught Jessie to sweep out the corners with a willow broom. Lawson returned from the far pasture with mud on his boots and a fresh cut on his hand. "That fence line giving you trouble?" she asked, wiping her palms on her apron. "Found a steer hung up in the wire. Had to put him down." He rinsed his hands in the bucket by the door, jaw tight. "Lost 3 this spring already." Geneva watched him wrap a strip of cloth around the cut. "You work alone," he nodded. "Always have." She glanced toward the children, then back at him. "That's a hard way." "Some things are meant to be hard," he said. "They keep the wrong sort out." She considered that, then said, "Or they keep the right sort from trying." Lawson didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. That evening, once the sun dipped behind the ridge and wind stirred the pine tops, Geneva stepped outside with a tin cup of broth. Lawson stood beside the corral, watching the horses shift restlessly under the stars. She handed him the cup. "You don't talk much," she said after a while. "I talk when there's something worth saying." "And is there?" He took a long sip, then handed the cup back. "I never asked you why you came anyway." She set the tin on the fence post. "Because I couldn't stay. Not where I was. And not just because of what folks said. It was what they didn't say, too. The way doors stopped opening. The way my children were looked at like they'd done something wrong just by being mine." Lawson nodded once, slow. "That's a kind of loneliness most folks never see." She looked at him. "And you," he leaned on the fence, one boot hooked behind the other. "I was 22 when I rode with a man named Clive Riggins. Thought he was ranching. Turned out he was rustling. By the time I figured it, we were too far into Montana and 3 deputies too dead." Geneva felt her breath catch but didn't speak. "I turned myself in at Fort Benton. Did my time. 5 years. Never told anyone after." Lawson looked at the sky. but sometimes I still see their eyes, the ones who died, the ones I left behind." "I don't think you've left anything behind," she said. He turned to her, surprised. "You carry it," she said simply. "Same as I do." They stood like that for several minutes, quiet except for the wind and the soft creak of the fence. Then Lawson said, "I've got a spare plot down by the creek. Soil's good, needs turning. Figured you might want your own garden." Geneva blinked, then nodded. "I'd like that." He straightened from the rail. "I'll show you after chores tomorrow if you're set on staying a while." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He didn't smile, but his eyes warmed. Back inside, Geneva trimmed the wick on the lantern and tucked the children into the loft while Lawson sat by the stove, tracing the rim of his cup with his thumb. She watched him a moment before turning down the lamp. She didn't know what to call what they were building. But it wasn't made of pity or desperation. It was steady. It was earned, and it was beginning. By the time the cottonwoods near the creek grew heavy with spring sap, Geneva had turned soil deep enough to catch her breath in. Her hands, once more used to lace-threaded parlor work, were calloused, now strong in a way that didn't need proving. Rows of early carrots and cabbage broke through the earth, and she kept a tin of crushed eggshells and soot near the garden edge to ward off pests. One morning, Lawson came down from the north pasture with a rusted iron kettle dangling from one hand and a loose stitched book under his arm. He set them both on the porch rail without a word. Geneva looked up from where she was mending a hem. "That kettle's seen better years." He stood with his thumb hooked in his belt. "Found it in the old line shack. Thought maybe you could use it for dyeing cloth." She ran her finger along the dented rim. "And the book." Joanna mentioned she was near through with the readers. "This one's got fables. Hardly any pages missing." She touched the worn spine, surprised. "Where'd you learn to read fables?" "Washed dishes for a school teacher when I was 14, he said. She couldn't pay in coin, so she paid in stories. That evening, she read aloud by lantern light. Her voice slow and steady, Jessie curled against her side, Joanna mouthing each word ahead of her. Lawson carved a length of pine by the doorway, his knife strokes even, his gaze flicking up only to catch the corners of her mouth when she smiled at the children's questions. Days stretched longer. The river swelled with meltwater, and Lawson began riding out earlier, not returning until the light turned gold. Geneva kept the cabin in rhythm, churning butter before sunup, pressing lye soap in wooden molds, teaching the children how to keep their shoulders straight when they spoke. One evening, after supper, she stepped outside with a basin of cooled water. Lawson was oiling his saddle under the awning, sleeves rolled, fingers stained from axle grease and dust. "I'd like to take the children into town next week," she said. "There's a woman at the church who gives lessons in ciphering." He didn't look up. "You'd be safe on your own. I can handle a half-day ride with a sharp stick and a sharper tongue." That drew a low chuckle from him. "Still, I'll ride in with you." She didn't argue. She didn't need to. As she turned to go back inside, Lawson stood suddenly. "Geneva," she paused. "I've been meaning to ask, that locket you wear, it's not just for show." She touched the chain around her neck, surprised. "No, it was my sister's. She died in Kansas City. Fever took her." He nodded, slow. "You were close." She was the only one who didn't ask me to explain myself. Lawson looked past her toward the edge of the tree line. "I had a brother once. Younger, quiet. He drowned trying to cross the Platte when the rains came sudden." She stepped closer. "And you were the one who sent him in." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She reached for the basin, then hesitated. "You've carried that a long time." Lawson met her eyes. "Some weights don't lift easy." Geneva replied, "Some don't have to. They just need another pair of hands." He looked at her, then not guarded, not wary, just tired in the way a man gets when he's finally willing to let someone else hold the rope for a while. The next morning, she caught him leaving early with 2 canteens and a wrapped parcel. "Taking salt pork to the Thompsons," he said. "Their boys got the measles, can't ride to town." She tied her bonnet and stepped down from the porch. "I'll come. It's a rough trail. I've walked rougher." He studied her a moment, then handed her one of the canteens. They rode in silence, the wind rising and falling like breath. When they reached the Thompson place, Geneva helped the mother wash linens and boil vinegar for the air, while Lawson mended a broken slat on the hen coop. On the ride back, she asked, "Why do you do it?" "All this for folks who keep their distance from you." He didn't answer right away. Then, "Because I know what it is to be left behind." They rode the last mile without speaking. The sun hung low, painting the sagebrush silver. Geneva thought of the years she had spent trying to be enough for people who had already made up their minds. She thought of Lawson, who asked for nothing but gave anyway. At the cabin, he dismounted and turned to help her down. His hand lingered at her waist, not in hesitation, but in quiet certainty. Her fingers brushed his. He didn't move. "I'm not afraid of being needed," she said. His voice came low. "Neither am I." The wind stirred the hem of her skirt. The door creaked faintly behind them. Somewhere inside, Jesse laughed in his sleep. Lawson stepped back, not because he wanted to, but because he trusted she would still be there in the morning. And she would. The following Monday, Geneva stood in the barn doorway, brushing sawdust off her skirt while Lawson fitted a new strap to his saddle. The morning was sharp and cloudless, the kind that made the air smell of iron and pine sap. Joanna and Jesse were inside, sketching their names on slates that a circuit teacher had left behind 2 winters earlier. The stillness around the cabin felt earned. Lawson tested the buckle, then looked up. "You ever work with a horse from Green?" Geneva leaned her shoulder against the post. "No, but I've seen what happens when someone pretends they have." He gave a nod, not quite a smile, and led out a young dun mare with a white blaze and twitchy ears. "This one's halfway broke. Got her off a trader who couldn't keep her fed. Thought she might take to gentle hands." Geneva stepped forward, palm out. The mare sniffed her fingers, then shifted her weight. "What's her name?" "Don't have one yet." She watched the mare's eyes, the way they tracked Lawson's voice. "Call her Mercy." Lawson tied the lead rope to a post and adjusted the cinch. "That name means something to you. Not everything has to," she said. "Sometimes it's just a hope." He tipped his hat back and studied her. "You're not like most women I've met out here. You've met too many who learned how to disappear." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just never looked hard enough." She reached for the brush, and he handed it over without a word. As she ran it down the mare's flank, Lawson fetched a pail of grain and poured it slow, the kernels ticking like rain against tin. "I've been thinking about building on," he said. "Adding another room off the back." Geneva kept brushing. "For what?" "For whatever comes." She paused, fingers tight around the bristle handle. "You sure?" he shrugged. "You cook better than I do. Kids don't flinch when I walk in now. Cabin feels different, like it's waiting for something besides winter." Geneva let the brush fall to her side. "You're not offering out of gratitude, are you?" "No," he said. "I'm offering because I like the way your voice sounds when you read to them, and because I don't like the quiet when you're gone." She stepped back from the mare. "That's not the same thing as wanting someone." "You're right," Lawson said. "I do want someone with a spine, someone who's lived through fire and didn't turn to ash." Geneva looked past him, toward the ridge where the first wildflowers were just beginning to show under the scrub. "And you think I'm her?" "I know you are." The breeze shifted, lifting the edge of her sleeve. "Then you'd best be sure, because I won't raise my children in a house built on half decisions." "I'm sure," he said. but I'll wait as long as it takes for you to be." She studied him, the lines around his eyes, the way he stood with both boots planted like he had nowhere else to be. Then she nodded once and turned back toward the cabin. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, she found him by the fire, sharpening his knife with slow, even drags against the whetstone. "I've been thinking too," she said, folding her hands in front of her, "about what kind of life I want. What kind of man I'd trust to help me build it." He set the knife down and looked up. "I don't want to be a guest here anymore," she said. "You're not. I want to plant fruit trees. I want to teach Jessie how to shoe a horse and Joanna how to hold her chin up when men talk over her. I want to lay down every night knowing exactly where I belong." Lawson stood slowly. "Then marry me." Her breath caught, but she didn't step back. "That's not a question." "I've only got one way of saying things," Lawson said, "and I mean every word of it." She stepped closer. "Then yes." He reached for her hands, rough palms closing over hers. "We'll need to ride into town. Preacher comes through on the third Sunday." "I know," she said. "I already asked." He laughed, quiet and low, and pressed his forehead to hers. The fire cracked behind them, and outside, the wind moved through the grass like a hush. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, there was no shame in her chest, no hunger clawing at her ribs. Just the weight of his hands, the steadiness of his breath, and the knowledge that she had chosen this life not out of desperation, but out of hope, and he had chosen her back. The preacher arrived on the third Sunday, just as Geneva had said he would. He was a lean man with a coat that hung like a curtain and eyes that squinted even in shade. By then, the garden rose by the creek had already begun to green, and the young mare, Mercy, stood calm under saddle. Lawson wore a clean shirt, the collar stiff from lye soap and sun. Geneva had brushed her hair back into a twist and pinned it with a comb she hadn't touched in years. Joanna and Jessie stood beside her, shoes polished with beeswax, faces solemn but bright. The ceremony took place beneath the cottonwoods, where the wind stirred the branches just enough to keep the flies away. There were no guests but the children, no music but the bird song, and no vows but the ones spoken plain and true. "I'll stand beside you," Lawson said, eyes steady on hers, "whether the land gives or takes." Geneva answered, "And I'll hold to you, not to what we've lost, but to what we build." The preacher nodded once, Bible closed in his hand. "Then it's done." Lawson reached for her hand, and she gave it without hesitation. Jessie took hold of his coat hem on one side, Joanna on the other. They walked back to the cabin together. After supper, Lawson took her hand again, not in ceremony this time, but in certainty, and led her out past the fence line, where the sky was wide and unhindered. The stars had come out early, and the grass whispered underfoot. He laid out a blanket on the slope above the creek. She sat beside him, boots off, skirt gathered around her knees. "You ever think it'd feel like this?" he asked. "I didn't think I'd feel again at all," she said. "Not in a way that didn't cost me something." Lawson reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small folded square. When she opened it, she found a faded ribbon dyed with the same deep red as the wildflowers growing along the ridge. "I saw you looking at them," he said. "Didn't know if it meant anything, just figured it might." Geneva held the ribbon to her cheek, eyes damp. "It's the color my sister used to wear in her hair. I'd forgotten." "You didn't forget. You just set it somewhere safe." She leaned into his shoulder, and they listened to the creek run below them. When they returned to the cabin, she tucked the ribbon into the top drawer beside her comb, careful and slow. Weeks passed. The cabin changed. Lawson built the new room with Jessie handing him nails and Geneva holding boards steady while Joanna sanded the edges smooth. The walls smelled of fresh pine, and the window looked east, toward the first light of morning. At the mercantile, folks still whispered, but they no longer looked away when Geneva entered with a list in her hand and a child at each side. She spoke little, bought only what they needed, and left with her head high and her shoulders at ease. Joanna learned her letters quick and began writing notes on scraps of feed sack paper. Jesse took to mending tack, his fingers nimble and sure. Lawson taught them how to salt meat and clean fish, how to read the sky for weather and the land for signs. One evening, when the wind carried the scent of summer rain, Geneva stood in the doorway and watched Lawson drive the last nail into the porch rail. He set the hammer down, wiped his brow, and looked up at her. "House finally feels finished," he said. She stepped out onto the porch, resting her hand on the rail he'd just fixed. "It's not the wood that makes it so." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and drew her close by the waist. "I'm proud of this," he said, voice low. "All of it, but most of you." She laid her hand over his heart. "Then we've both come further than we ever thought we could." That night, rain tapped gently on the roof, and Geneva lay beside him beneath the quilt, the children asleep in the next room. Lawson's arm was warm around her middle, and the future no longer felt like something that waited out of reach. It felt like something already blooming beneath their feet. Years passed, soft and sure. The orchard they planted 3 apple trees, and 1 pear bore fruit by the 5th year. Joanna began teaching younger children in town, her chin always high. Jesse worked the herd with Lawson, his shoulders steady and his word true. Geneva kept the comb on the shelf, the ribbon tied around its handle. She never once looked back beyond the mountains they'd left behind. There was no need. The past had shaped them, but it did not own them. What they had now was theirs. And every morning when the sun rose over the ridge and painted the cabin in gold, Lawson would find her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hands in flour or coffee or seed. He would kiss her temple, always in the same spot, and say, "Morning, Mrs. Dade." And she would smile, not because she had forgotten where she came from, but because she had finally arrived where she was meant to be.